For Victims and Villains, my name is Josh, and today we are jumping into the magnificent return of Hammer Horror with Doctor Jekyll. Or maybe, who knows, maybe it's not such a magnificent return. Let's talk about it. So this modern day retelling, it basically puts Eddie Izzard front and center to take over the roles of Jekyll Hyde and hires a recent inmate that has been released back into society, ultimately to kind of help around the house, and he gets a little bit more than he bargained for. I feel like growing up in the 90s, and like early 2000s, like Eddie Izzard's comedy and projects were always really front and center for some reason in my vicinity some way. I feel like I haven't seen Eddie Izzard do anything in a really long time, and so I was really excited to see what she was capable of in a role like this. For the most part, Eddie Izzard has always been a comedian. I know in recent years she's become an activist on a few different topics, but this was really the first time that I've ever seen her as an actress take on a more dramatic role, and she absolutely crushes it. I really loved also what they did with the Jekyll Hyde dynamic. This feels like a perfect entry point. So if you've never heard of the story or never read or know the twist, there is a lot that happens here that this feels like it could be like a refreshing, like onboarding point to hear this story or view this story for the first time. I think Izzard plays the part perfectly. She embraces this duality that it just showcases a wide range of talent from her, both being able to be really funny, but also at the same time, this very dramatic, very fragile and borderline psychotic mixture in there, a little bit of vulnerability. And I just thought this was a really well done performance, and it's really encapsulated who Jekyll and Hyde are as characters, but also at the same time, this is just an absolute showcase of her talent as an actress. I would argue that pacing is probably the biggest hill that this film kind of has to overcome. This film has a really limited cast, but yet it feels like in having that limited cast, it makes some questionable choices narratively. Scott Chambers plays the felon in this movie that's kind of being integrated back into society. He is absolutely outstanding in this movie, by the way. His performance right on par with Izzard. I really loved his entire arc throughout the course of this movie. I thought it was just really well written, really well played. But in this process, they essentially establish that Izzard is a billionaire who is kind of a recluse. Think Batman Beyond Bruce Wayne, how he is. And it's a really big deal when Chambers' character starts working for Izzard, and they provide this backstory that really serves no larger purpose to the grander story. So Chambers' character has a subplot in this movie that kind of tries to give him a backstory, doesn't really work as a backstory. It feels like they tried to do it as character development, doesn't work as character development. Ultimately, what this subplot comes out as it hurts the pacing, takes away from the actual interesting portions of the narrative with Chambers and Izzard, and creates a bunch of really one-note characters that bring nothing to this script. I feel like had this movie just been Izzard and Chambers, this movie's legs would have been significantly stronger foundation for it to stand on. But unfortunately, a lot of these elements really hurt the final product. And on top of that, this cast is incredibly small. And even with a small cast, it feels like only two characters are really worth exploring and really interesting enough to pursue. All right, well, let's run this one through the Rorschach rating scale. I'm going to go ahead and give Dr. Jekyll a 3 out of 5. Overall, I think the majority of this movie is really solid. I think this is not necessarily the triumphant return that they were hoping for with the legacy of Hammer horror, but I ultimately would argue that it's still a very good movie nonetheless. Eddie Izzard, Scott Chambers, their performances alone are really well. I love the dialogue and I love the banter and the chemistry between the two of them. Izzard gives one of her best performances in her entire career. And I really just think that this movie has some pacing problems and some storytelling problems that could have just been throwaway lines or exposition, but instead we gotta show you. And it just results in really awkward storytelling, to say the least. So Dr. Jekyll is now out, available on digital. So you guys can click the links in the description below to check it out for yourself today. If you guys have seen it, whether it was during its festival run or you've already rented it, let me know in the comments below what you guys thought about it. But let's talk about mental health. If you guys are new to our content, our channel specifically talks about mental health through pop culture. And this is the part of the video where we take a theme of mental health out of the film which we're reviewing, talk about it for a few moments in the hopes to deconstruct the stigma surrounding mental health. Specifically for this film, I want to talk about the arc of Scott Chambers. A lot of it is him having to overcome kind of people's expectations because he has this one bad thing on his resume that is kind of stained his life for the worst. And I think that's kind of what we do sometimes as individuals and people, whether we know it or not. And unfortunately, we do that ourselves, whether we know it or not, or whether we want to admit it or not. We judge people all the time based on the color of their skin, their sexual identity, their gender identity, whether or not they vote Republican or Democrat or independent, or what they choose to wear, or what they believe religiously. And there's a number of different avenues that we could take this conversation, but at the end of the day, it hurts the mental health of the people that are the targets of these comments and conversations. Bullying is not cool whatsoever, and I know that sounds really cliche to see or to hear. Bullying can have long-lasting effects that can result in things like depression, substance abuse, alcoholism, suicide, or even result in the abusee becoming the abuser. So my challenge would be to echo the words of my friend Dino and just be excellent to one another. As simple as that. If you or someone you know is going through any type of bullying or any type of depression or anything else that affects your mental health, consider the mental health resource library we have in the show notes below. Once again, Dr. Jekyll is now available to stream or rent on VOD, depending on which country that you are in. If you are in the UK, you also can check it out on the big screen. And below, you can also check out our podcast network, our film festival selections for this year, and much more. And the subscribe button so that you do not miss awesome movie reviews, podcast interviews, etc. We'll catch you guys on the next side. And remember to keep it classy.